you very much. Right, so as it says, growing a company with XP, specifically Unruly. I fully intend this to be a conversation, so I'm going to tell you about how we do things. If something doesn't make sense, it would really help, especially because there's only a few of us. If someone just puts their hand up and goes, actually, can you explain that bit because it sounds interesting or wrong. I was saying to somebody else at the beach yesterday, if somebody says to me, actually, that just seems silly, why do that? That would be the best thing that somebody can say, because then we can genuinely have a debate about it.
Careful what you ask for.
So first bit is, I always like to ask who's in the room. So if you're a product person, you stick your hand up. Product people. If you're a developer, stick your hand up. Okay. If you're neither of those two things, you stick your hand up. Okay, cool. Right. So why did Unruly do XP? The biggest reason is this bit here: vague or rapidly changing requirements. In the business, I'm blinding myself, so I'm going to move this way. In the business that we work in, which is video advertising, things change very, very rapidly. We don't have 3-year roadmaps because we don't know where the company's going to be in 3 years. We don't know where our clients are going to be in 3 years. So everything I'm going to talk about from this point onwards is underpinned by the fact that this works for us because of the volatile nature of the business that we work in. If you're making the same product that you have done for 50 years and you intend to do it for another 50, maybe this isn't the best process for you. But if you are in a volatile market such as us, then XP lends itself really, really well. Also, I said a bit about Unruly. So we were founded in 2006. These are 3 lovely founders, and they said they wanted to do XP from the beginning, and it's not something that we had to bring into the company and sort of mutate back into XP, but it's something that we did from the ground up, which kind of meant that we were working with a clean slate, which luckily sidesteps a lot of the problems of convincing people it's a good idea. Interestingly though, what's happened more so now is as the company's grown and we're bringing people in, those new people are the ones that we're going to have to convince. So it's not the inside out, it's the other way around. It's bringing in a new CFO who's never worked in a company that has done things this way, and bringing those people on board. So internal training is really important for the new guys, much more than worrying about the guy who's been here 100 years. So, as I said, life at Unruly, what does that consist of? It consists of a lot of XP practices. I will be talking about our product development team. So a lot of these things should be familiar. So paired programming, incremental design, continuous integration, continuous deployment, all that good stuff. What it's not is Scrum. It's not a big deal that it's not Scrum, but just in case you think this is just XP practices wrapped up in a Scrum framework, it's not. We literally do nothing in Scrum.
But except for the parts that were obviously already in XP.
Yeah, apart from those things, but I think they belong to us first, so like the Scrum team. Yeah. So what do we do? Pair programming. What does that actually mean? What does that entail? It means we have pairs coding together. One screen, 2 keyboards. That means that they are constantly in discussion with each other. They literally share a keyboard. One of them you use your driver and navigator. They rotate daily. So I was at another conference, Agile North, where I was listening to a team that was saying, oh, we do pair programming, but we don't rotate very often. I was like, how long is very often? It's like a couple of months. And I was like, sweet mother of God, working with one person for a couple of months. The only person I can do that with is my fiance, and that's an entirely different relationship. So a really, really good tip, if you are going to do pair programming, rotate as often as you can. Why is good problem solving? If you get roadblocked by something and someone's literally sitting next to you, they are the best cardboard developers that actually talk and they know what you're on about. So that's a quick way of a very small feedback loop fixing problems without having to pull in other people. Also learning new things. So as you rotate in, each of the developers are different, each have different styles, and the quickest way of transferring that is by osmosis. So you're just sitting next to each other and it bleeds into the other developers. And it also means that if someone hates doing UI work because all they want to do is play with databases, they'll pair with someone and they'll learn that stuff as they go, as opposed to being given that task and then just staring at it for 8 hours. So that works as well. And so sharing knowledge, and that's not just technical knowledge, this is domain knowledge as well. So if you sit there and you work with someone, they can help explain, what effectively is quite a large legacy system that has been around for donkeys and has bits and pieces all over the shop. So, really basic principles. We sit together. So we are globally distributed, but our development team is based in London in our headquarters, and that is pretty much the plan forever. We don't intend to outsource any of our development because of the cost of not being able to work collaboratively with each other and directly with our main users and stakeholders. An informative workspace, so everyone sticks stuff to walls. Another great example of how this slightly differs is I went to an office that had huge white space on the walls that people could write in, and there was this beautiful radial graph drawn on one of the walls, right? There's like, different rings. And I was like, I can't believe for a second that these walls are actually being used because that's too perfect a drawing and nobody's wiped that off for like 6 months. I really wanted to sneak away and actually see if I could rub it off because I reckon it'd probably stay. So our spaces are genuinely informative. When we have meetings, I make it a principle to always wipe the boards down to give people blank canvases to write on as opposed to just having posters reflecting back information to you, because it pretty much sets your mindset already, or if people aren't reading stuff that is irrelevant. So we have the whiteboards on wheelies. They get wiped down, they get moved around very regularly. They're moved around as and when they're needed ad hoc, right? Not just for just having stuff on display. So shared view, we spend a lot of time making sure that the entire team knows where it's going, so we don't have architects in the same way that just tell the team what they're going to build, and or BAs telling them why they're going to have to build it. It's a collaborative shared view. That means that any one of those people should be able to tell you why we're doing the things we're doing, as well as just how and when. Release when ready. So the best anecdote for this is one of the developers started said that she released more on her first week than in the last year at her previous place. Incredibly scary for some developers who have not done it before, but you learn to test things in production, and it makes sure that you're on your game, and you're not letting something push out, and we'll worry about that when the testers come back with their results, because it's all your responsibility. So much like the keynote said, giving people that transparency with the system that they're working on that says, if you mess it up, it's your job to fix it, kind of removes any of that ambiguity as to where the responsibility lies for the system that they're building. And there's no dev team, there's no product team, so there's just a bunch of people. There is pro dev, so product development. So we don't have a separate department for each of the faculties that we represent. This is the basic model of it. So we have software engineers who are led by a team lead. The team lead is sometimes rotating, sometimes not, depending on how the team's structured, and they have an embedded product manager with them. And that's it. They're about as flat as each other. There's not a great deal of hierarchy on purpose. In fact, we decide our job titles by a form and by voting. That's it. It's a quorum and stuff. Very well. Outside of that, we have our UX, infra, and our agile coach, which I'll mention later on. But what we don't have is project managers or project plans, business analysts to write requirement docs, software architects, quality assurance, or scrum masters or foremen, although I did wear a hard hat once. So the often question is about how do you get on, and that's hopefully what I'll explain in more detail. What that translates to give you an idea of scale, is 3 teams, chutney, marmalade, and Tabasco. They like condiments. So these 2 teams, they work very, very closely together, and there's this slight overlap here. This overlap is not really there anymore. It used to be there. So these 2 teams shared a bit of code originally because one team grew out of the other. So we had a team of about 8 developers, and we realized that they got to a size now where it was more efficient to go back down to 5 and 4 people in the team. And we started breaking out their code base so that one team could focus on our ad units, and one team could focus on the actual platform that our users use. But that idea of incubation is something that we want to carry on, so that you don't bring on a brand new team, you don't hire 4 developers at a time, which anyone can, I'm bloody impressed. But as they come on, they grow with the team, and then eventually split out into their own separate unit. Like Tabasco did. So Tabasco did that previously. They grew out into our separate product strand, but they all used to belong to a central team. So a year and a half ago, we were just one relatively large team, which was about 20 developers, and now broken down into these smaller units. So one of the reasons for this is that Agile at scale, having massive teams is really hard. It's not really hard. Just have lots of small teams. As long as they're self-sufficient small units, they work pretty well, and you can have as many of those as you like. But we also have those people outside of the team. They're called our specialists. So Rachel, a lot of you guys will know, is our Agile coach. Mike, who did a talk here last year, is our UX expert. Stan will be the closest thing we have to a dedicated DevOps guy. He manages the sort of backend, pure backend stuff. So occasionally he won't know what day of the week it is, but he'll know where everything's running in Singapore. And they're really good because they allow a small team to still be able to pull in specialists as and when required. And they're not always required. So the UX specialist is not always required on stories for one team. And there's no point having him just sitting there twiddling his thumbs when he can be distributed as and when needed. So it's like, it allows us to be very flexible with our allocation. Embedded product managers, so slightly differently. UX is really useful for individual stories, but product manager is embedded with the team to help them facilitate the conversations that they need to build the relationships those developers need to have to be able to do their jobs properly. That's why a product manager sticks with a strand of work or definitely at least a team of work. So the idea there is that I'm not a product owner, although sometimes I would love to be. What I am though is someone that can speak to developers and speak to the rest of the business and find out what middle ground we need to establish before we can talk effectively about the stories that they want to write. So it's a facilitation role, so that the people that need to talk to each other get as close to each other as possible. And that is the principle of XP, is that you're bringing your users directly to your developers. And product owners are not users, they're a proxy. And embedded coach. So what would Rachel do? Really, really good. So this takes care of our spirituality in the office. Having someone like her, because at the end of the day, as much as I love my developers, I have an agenda. I want to make sure that my product strand achieves its goal. And developers also have an agenda in this. They want to make their code as clean as possible and write the best code they can. What Rachel is in a unique position to do is try to look at things without an agenda and try to just build a cohesive team that actually wants to work together. And that wanting to work together removes a lot of the making them work together. So it is very, very special to have someone like that on our team, and it means that we gel better. Outreach support, this is another fun idea that we have, which is we have solutions engineers, which are our frontline support, but we also purposely sacrifice one of our developers in the daily stand-up, knife across the throat, and we throw them into the pit of support. Why do we do this? We do this because it means that they can understand our users' needs at a very, very direct level. Sometimes they think it's a chore, but it's not. It means they will write better code as a result. They will write stuff and they'll understand the principles, especially when you have something like advertising where there's about 1 million acronyms. And very recently, someone who's new to the team wrote a brilliant unit test, and they were like, CPM is this multiplied by that. Great. Problem in fact they didn't know what CPM was. CPM is cost per mil, which is cost per 1,000, and they got their calculation wrong by 1,000. Yeah, and that is just like really. And only by knowing and talking to our operations team, our marketing team, on a frequent basis, not every day, will you understand that conversation and be able to share that domain knowledge. And also it changes, like any team left long enough will mutate on its own. And without that regular contact, the things that we think our operations team do and what they actually do diverge very, very quickly. So it maintains that contact. And there's innumerable instances where we're sitting around estimating a story and go, actually no, that assumption isn't correct. I've heard an ops person say they used to do that, but they've now done this thing differently. So the feedback loop is another source from who's exposed to doing frontline support. Embedded UX. So as I said, this is Mike. So Mike jumps around from team to team as the UX expert, but also helps try to form consistency between the 3 teams. So I went to the talk yesterday from I think Melissa, and she was talking about trying to make things go just beyond pretty. And one of my questions is, when you're just creating new features that have never existed before, how do you know where to draw the line in terms of how nice it has to be? Because it just works often means it just works. And having an embedded UX person brings that professionalism to the UX and tries to build a standard across it, which is really, really useful. Because developers have their strengths and weaknesses, and often UI and UX isn't something that they're confident enough to say, I know a good pattern for this UI, and that's what UX brings.
And I would guess having somebody like that just as part of the team, sort of the typical feedback cycle that happens where the people who don't have that skill learn just enough to sort of know what some of the basic patterns are.
Yeah.
So they can do something plausibly good, but you still have the expert around to say, in this case, maybe we should do this, or in this case, you don't even necessarily have to go that far.
Yeah.
And you sort of learn from each other as they go.
Absolutely, and another thing about having them as a genuine member of the team is that it doesn't become us and them.
Right.
Which is very easy. I think somebody else mentioned that the enemy is anybody who's not you. And having them as part of the team means that they share your problems, they come to your stand-up, and the relationship is a lot more organic. So the suggestions and the work that they do together is a lot more organic as well. So again, as opposed to having somebody phoned in to do the UX works and hand off mock-ups, for example. Developers drive story discovery. So this is another big one. So we don't have EAs, as I mentioned, but we do stories, and we do make sure that we're doing the right stories. And the way that's done is through a process where a developer is given a strand of work that they're responsible for. Now that developer is entitled to use anybody in the business he needs to make him understand or make her understand what needs to be delivered. So use me to go out and speak to facilitate meetings with the rest of the business. Use other developers to share the workload of investigating stories. But a developer who understands the system is also someone who understands why we're having to change it for a specific reason. And that, again, that is an underpinning of everything that we do. And it's quite a big change because, as I've said to a lot of you, a lot of developers, when they come in, when they've never done this before, they're like, the best thing I can do is write code. If you leave me alone, I will write 8 hours of code for you. And what we always say in return is you're paid to think, not to code. So this is one way of giving them that responsibility to look after a strand of work. And I'm going to talk more about how these stories actually come in. So if somebody has a hot new idea, I've thought of this amazing UI format. If we make it green instead of blue, it's going to revolutionize the business. I go speak to either one of those frontline support people, which we call LRs, Lone Rangers, or I speak to a product manager, or I speak to someone in the kitchen. It doesn't matter, that's not the important bit. The important bit is you make contact with the development team. We then log that request, and that Lone Ranger or that product owner then goes out and speaks to stakeholders and gets a very quick feel for whether this story has any legs, right? And the truth of the matter is that new people think they've got the new solution every 5 minutes, but a lot of them have been tried. If you do any business long enough, ideas kind of come and go quite regularly. So that initial conversation, we go up and we say, hey CEO, I did this yesterday actually, Wednesday. Somebody wants to do this to our system, what do you reckon? And we have a very quick conversation. And most often, we bin it. So everyone agrees that failing fast is great, we forget fast. So if it's not an interesting story, if it doesn't have a lot of clear business value to it, we throw it away. And that means genuinely throw it away, so not a huge archive of stories, but we just get rid of it. Because we know that if there is a business need and we have a system in place where people are able to raise that, it will come back if it's genuine. If it's not, it will get forgotten about, it's not worth the paper it's written. But if it is a good idea, we have a process which is too small to read on this screen, that basically says, do you have enough information now to prepare a story? And this is the developer now. The developer has been given the story. If they don't, in the estimation session, spikes were mentioned. They go ahead and they can put in a spike story. There's flexibility in the resourcing for the development team that allows them to be able to do this either in their own time or as part of a sort of a dev task, so something outside of the natural velocity of the team's story work. If not, they can actually put it into the story. If it's a big chunk, it's like if someone says to me, I want you to build a whole new RTB architecture. That's a big bit of work for us. So we can put the spike stories as actual stories into the velocity. And it really depends on the complexity and the size of figuring out what the requirement is. So the other alternative is, no, I figured out, and the other, is it still a hot idea? And the answer is, no, we've been great. And that, that's where I want all of the stuff to go to, because that's just wasted. Yeah, so I thought about it, and I figured it out, and turns out it would take 8 years to do. So is that a good idea? No, it's not been. If it's still a good idea, if we still have stakeholder approval, we write it up we go back to the original user and we say, look, we've written up your story. We've given you a rough ballpark. Ballparks, when I mention them, are much more useful as a guide to the users who are actually requesting that story than they are for anything else. They're an initial an indicator of how much trouble this story is going to get in once it goes up against other stories. If you have great business value but it's a massive story, you're in for a fight. If it's great business value and it's a very, very small story, then great. Then you're going about it the right way. And it's very useful for the operations team and the marketing team and the sales team to understand how the prioritization works. Because there is no magic. Our CEO doesn't know any more than anyone else in the business does. He wants to know how expensive it is and how much value you get. So we give that information back to the users who then have to, if they want to, champion it with their stakeholders, which I'll explain in a sec. Story gets fully estimated, and then it gets given back to the team. I'm going to go into more detail. Story user stories. This is an example. It's a bit antiquated because we don't really write them on cards anymore, but it's very familiar. But what we do have is we have story owners and stakeholders. So a story owner is a very, very small product owner. It's the person that when I say person, it's the individual that is identified before a story is started, and it says, okay, we've taken your story, it's gone through our entire process, and we're going to do it, we've committed to doing it. What do you understand by the story? Has anything changed? And it's a really important step because even in 3-week iterations, which is what we have, things can still change. And we've had stories even recently where we've gone back and gone, right, we're going to start the story, do you still need it? And they've gone, actually, things have changed, no we don't. So that individual is responsible for understanding the scope and what is going to be delivered and helping to shape the acceptance criteria. Now the acceptance criteria, as they'll do, will just be like, I expect it to do X, Y, and Z. And the developers will then translate that either into unit tests, behavioral tests, whatever it needs to do to be able to satisfy that when it comes back all the way around to getting the story to sign off. And then stakeholders, so stakeholders tend to be head of departments, our CTO, our CEO, people that can look at things at a holistic level beyond an individual department. So they're the people who sit around in the room and help us prioritize the iteration. And they're not story owners either, and they're not product owners. They are the people that can, as a group, decide the priorities of the business. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? All right, good, nodding faces. So, internal users, stakeholders, they're everywhere. We've got them left to right. This is a string diagram that we have stuck up on our wall. It's useful because then you know what time zone they're in as well. But it's also useful to understand the relationships. So when we have a campaign manager run into to a developer and says, this is the worst thing that could possibly happen, what actually happens is it's probably not. It's probably just a really bad day for that one campaign manager. And in the grand scheme of things, with what's going on in the US, what's going on in Paris, the stakeholder will come to a different conclusion. Or worse yet, the other thing happens. Oh, it's fine. The client asked us to do this thing, and we'll do it. It's not a big deal. I can fudge it. Stakeholder finds out about it and goes, actually, that has much larger implications for the rest of the business. So there is useful information that will come out of both sources, and they are very separate from each other. And it's useful that you can recognize the difference between what's a stakeholder and what's an internal user or a story owner. And we have story time. There's cookie and there's milk. And what we do is the person who's been given that story, that developer, that dev owner, comes to the rest of the team with their story after going and doing all the stuff that we just discussed and shows it to the rest of the team. Now this is the opportunity of the team that has to ask the questions of why we're doing it and how do you think we're going to do it. Not literally, I've written it up already, can you now just copy and paste this in, when you sit down with me as a pair. This is, just make sure I'm good for time. This is about making sure that they understand the rough guidelines of what the acceptance criteria. And then sometimes they'll go, actually, you haven't thought this out properly. Go back and speak to the user again, or go back and maybe do a spike because I'm not sure about that kind of line of implementation. And also they do estimations here as well. So estimations is a really fun thing to watch. Me and Rachel, we often go to these sessions. Actually, I always go to the ones that involve my product strands. And we cold read the developers. It's a great fun game that anybody can play. You sit there and you watch, and you can actually estimate a story without ever having to write a line of code, just by reading the developers' reactions to stories. So please do try it. But the important thing is that they build a consensus and they build a mental agreement of what this story entails. And that is actually far more valuable than the number that they come out with. Because the number they come out with is useful and it helps frame the iterations, but the agreement that I've understood the story to involve these parts of the system is the thing that actually drives value for doing it as a team. Because as I said, an individual could come up with a number and it would be somewhere within the margin of error in accuracy. That's not as useful as having a team form a consensus. So that equals this. All right, there you go. So our developer assigned to an individual story, so he has a responsibility to making sure that story finds its way to its appropriate place, sometimes in the bin. We have an estimate, so this is a fully estimated story, and we have a story inside of it. So I actually don't have the story exploded out, but as I said, we have these strands of brand safety, which happens to be Benji's story, but he could have given it to somebody else. And we have acceptance criteria that have been agreed with the user class for 0 out of 3, ready for the team to work on. And we have super story time. So super story time is something that grew out of the fact that the teams, whilst being entirely independent in terms of deployment, in terms of code, they still have a lot of business overlap. Whereas if we change one thing, it will affect the team. So the two teams come together, that equals this, right? So Trello, highly sophisticated enterprise product that you have to pay thousands of dollars for a month, is really good because it's lightweight. You don't need a lot of bells and whistles, but what it does do is it very quickly lays out all the stories that we have and what state they're in. Again, if you need to produce reports for your exec that tell them exactly how many stories we have and all that stuff, this isn't the program to use. But the question we asked is, who actually is going to look at that? What valuable information are we giving to our CFO when we tell her how many Trello cards we've archived? And there isn't any. So we stopped using target. As I said, it doesn't do everything really well. We have to use a plugin to just count up the numbers. But it's flexible and it's lightweight, and it means it's something that we can drop if it stops being useful for us as a team, and that's really useful for us. We don't want to get tied into one process for very long. And then story prioritization. So we've talked a lot internally about why don't we just move to Kanban, and the truth of the matter is that we kind of have. We have stories, and they get pulled into a team's iteration, but the prioritization meetings that happen every 3 weeks are a logistical ceremony, because getting all of our senior stakeholders into a room together or on Hangouts is actually quite hard. And we know that the stories that we have within that 3-week story don't move around enough for us to worry about it. Very regularly, once every 3 iterations, the story will still come in and bump everything out and then get moved into an iteration. So they're not cast iron sprints, but what they are is just a business agreement as to what we're doing for the next 3 weeks. But very, very uncontroversially, we can send an email saying things have changed. Does anybody care about moving this story for that story? And then those same stakeholders get an email, and then if it does come up, then we can bring them back and have another meeting. Yeah.
How long did you work? Did you ever work with sort of the typical strict iteration heartbeat? Did you ever spend any time where saying, yeah, we're just going to have 2-week iterations for a while so sort of get used to it, or did you adopt this the more flexible planning early on?
The biggest change that I've seen since we've started is that we used to do the planning in after the planning meetings. So we would have one of these meetings as you see here, and then all the stories that got into that iteration would then get fully estimated.
Right.
And then those are the ones that you start. So it'd be very hard to swap in a story because you need to have everyone together to do the estimations. Right. So what we did was we took out the estimation from that process and just did it throughout the week, so the story times that you saw there. That means that we have a backlog of ready stories, which made swapping stuff in and out a lot easier.
Right, but were you always doing like release when ready from the beginning?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I meant about the Kanban thing. We always release when ready. We never release at the end of an iteration.
So then the iterations were more about like, well, we now have an idea sort of how much stuff to look at estimating in detail. It's sort of how much work should we look at thinking about doing?
Yeah.
And it's
So on this here, you've got to be considered in cut, right?
Right.
So these really rough lines are based on our current velocity, how much work can we put in front of the business and have a reasonable conversation with?
Right.
If we put in 3 stories, they'll just go, no, I don't actually, like, that's not enough to have a conversation with.
Right.
But if we put 20 stories in, that's too much, and it's a waste of time for us to go and individually investigate all those stories. So our velocity gives us a marker on how much is a useful amount of stories to have sort of warm, and then we go out. But the actual development and deployment is independent of the iteration.
That's just basic one-piece flow.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. 2 on a good day. We can run.
Well, one at a time, not one at a day.
So yeah, story prioritization gets you this. So as I mentioned here, you've got one team's stories. All the threads are then pulled in together as a business, because as much as brand safety is important, it has to be weighed up against other strands in the business. And then we always have a healthy backlog of fully estimated stories in case something happens. These ones or the priorities change. Or, heaven forbid, we start running ahead of ourselves and need to pick up more work. So if we finish all the stories in the iteration, we don't go, great, let's go to the pub for the next week. We pull in an extra story because something's changed in that team, our velocity's gone up, maybe we've hired a new developer and they're picking up speed. So we don't game the system very much. Another one, useful thing to try out is continuous timeline. So everybody in our teams do retrospectives. One of the things that we struggled with in retrospectives was remembering what happened 3 weeks ago. Again, the retrospectives are done on a 3-week basis purely because it's easier to calendar. But what we started doing is having a continuous timeline. This one's in the shape of a Monopoly board, where every day when you do a stand-up, you jot down the salient points of that stuff for that day. And then when you come back to it in 3 weeks, you go, oh yeah, no, I remember that. And that was painful, because we do forget things. We forget good things a lot more than we forget bad things. So this is something that's helped us maintain a useful conversation in our retrospectives. And yeah, retrospectives. One of the cool things I just want to show you, if I have a board pen. Is there a board pen? Oh yeah, that. So we've done this stuff before where everyone like charts their feelings. I don't like that one because it's too wishy-washy. One of the ones that I do really enjoy at the moment is I can write English properly. Bad long. Good long. Bad quick. Good quick. Right? So when we go through the points of a iteration, in the retrospective, we try to put it out into these different quadrants, and we try to find a way of getting everything as much into the good quick section as possible. So we identify things that were great but took us a long time, and we talk about them and how we could move them into the good quick section. And then likewise, we find out the things that were bad and long, and we find out what can we do to make them at least less painful.
How do we get rid of them?
Yeah, and the bad quick ones, it's just like, how do we just make sure we don't have too many of these that we start clogging ourselves up with just like mind-numbing things that nobody gets any value out of, like restarting and stuff. So this kind of framework, not just going back and sort of going, oh, that was a good iteration, oh, that was a bad iteration, but what happened within that iteration that will generate new working agreements, new actions that will then make the next one have more stuff in this corner and less stuff in that corner. And the prime directive I like to put up there because it's not a blaming session. If your retrospectives feel like one, stop them, because they're actually then more damaging than they are useful. But we do them on a regular basis, and we don't skip them because they force the team to take stock of how the iteration is going, even when they think they're too busy. So it's something to hold on to, I think. Visible support. So information mediators, we have them. They're great. They're really, really good, especially at stand-up because they complement the boards. So we can look up and not only decide which stories we're going to work on by how many we have and where they are in the queue, but how much support is going on. Are solutions engineers currently getting battered? Do we need to have 2 LRs instead of 1? And we can make those decisions without a lot of upfront thinking, literally within the time a stand-up takes, by having that information to hand. So a lot of stand-ups you see pictured of people standing around looking at each other. What we try to do is literally make an agreement to break that and be all looking at the board. Because if you're looking at the board, you're thinking, oh, we're this far through the iteration, these things have happened in the last week. This is the information that is coming through for the last 24 hours, and you can make a group decision about what's going on, as opposed to going, yeah, no, that was really boring yesterday when that thing happened. Remember that thing? And he's standing there going, I don't know what he's talking about, but I'm too polite to interrupt. So it's a much more directive conversation. Visualizing types of work. So this is another thing, was that because we have 3 teams, we have an ABC test. So each team tries out different things, and the good things survive and get passed on to the other teams, whereas the bad things fall away and don't affect the other team. So it's a really a great way of just having different teams try stuff out and being close enough that the good things can spread. And as I said, this is what I meant about like effectively a Kanban system where we have our stories, they go through initial chat, they're in progress and they're pulled in, and we don't try to take on too much. And then when it's something done, I could do another talk on that in its entirety, but we put that behind the release email, which is a strange artifact, but it's the developer or the developers working on it last who write a release email to the business saying, this feature is now complete. It's already been in production, probably 24 to 36 hours already, because they put it in production to test it finally. But the release email says, we are now happy with it. And they'll go, okay, I'm going to take 1 more minute just to check it before I send that email. And it's a useful thing, again, about increasing the transparency between the development team and the rest of the business. These releases don't go out in the dead of night. They actually go out with an email, and the people have to sign off on it.
I'm guessing that's a personal accountability they're giving because it's their name against it.
Yeah, I mean, they're not accountable then to fix the thing themselves. The team still has to fix it. It's not like, Arber said this is story to fix, so Arber has to now spend the night fixing it. But it means that at least they understand the story well enough to explain it to the rest of the business, and then the team takes it back if there's some sort of hiccup. But as I said, if they're doing everything right, then there'll be at least one person in the business goes, yeah, I definitely know that story is correct because I signed it off. And then the rest of the business then just picks up the training. So, as I said, the making sure things are actually done is the best part of the job, because until it's out in the wild, it's not really done, until it's being used. The other thing is visualizing types of work. So we do dot counting, we do tallies and this and the other, but the best thing about doing it is, as I said, just marking stuff up here. Sorry, it's going to dry up. Is marking the information that is relevant to that team at that time. So if there's a specific type of task that has cropped up, start tracking it. But don't then make it a rule, don't then put it into process, don't put it into documentation that it has to be, because it loses meaning. So we try to keep track of information that we think is going to be useful to us in the next iteration, the next 2 iterations, as opposed to just trying to maintain a doomsday book of everything that's been involved. So dot counting. It's something that one of our teams did for a while, another team has adopted, the other team has now stopped doing it, because there are times when, as the volatility changes of the different teams, the amount of time they're spending in certain areas it starts to affect other bits of it. So recruitment, you can see here in orange, is insignificant. But at the moment we're in a big recruitment drive, and it's actually reducing the capacity of the team to work in the other channels, so development, DevOps and whatnot. So this is useful for us to keep a handle of things, and also to tell the business our velocity is going to go down because we're having to increase one of these channels of work. So again, it's about deriving meaning from these graphs as opposed to just having them in the backlog. And then once the team's ticking over again, you can just stop doing it. And I think it is goal cards. So if you do pair programming, it's great at getting information from one person to another. How do we get information from outside in? One of the things we do is 20% of the developers' time they get, which is effectively 1 day, 3 days in iteration, is to work on their own stuff. So this is free reign from the business. They can work on something hopefully is useful to the business, but not necessarily. This is really great because it brings new ideas to a team that is quite mature and has been there for a few years. And then that information that they've had is then passed on through the pair programming. So again, there's a useful loop there. Because if there was individuals doing 20% time that then weren't talking to the rest of the business, that information is caught up within that one individual. So this is how we start thinking about trying out new languages or trying out new technologies, because that person is then able to sort of build up buy-in from the rest of the team as they pair. And we thought about using Cassandra, because I've been doing it in my goal card, and look, and then now the person agrees or disagrees, and then bring that to the rest of the team, as opposed to being stuck with individuals. Learning, so as I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk, this culture is something that we built from the ground up and we're quite proud of it. So when new people come in, they get put into a tech academy where they get to share the information from the team. And another useful thing about this is that it means that the developers then have to present back their business, their domain, to the new developers. And one of the best ways of learning is by trying to teach it to somebody else. So it's a mutually beneficial exercise. It means people learn faster and also developers re-establish the information that they're already expected to know. Conference allowance, yay! I get to come here. Coding dojos at lunchtime, lightning talks every Thursday, and X-Prolo, so it's a meetup that we have in our office, which some people attend, which is another opportunity to share the information, because that's what we want. We want really good developers that stay in the company, and that's the idea. So we wanted them to have as much exposure to the outside world as possible. All right. So mistakes, consistency between teams. The teams are cool. They can do stuff and they can mutate on their own and then translate that information. But the thing is that the business on top of that team is the same. So it's the same stakeholder that has to now understand why one Tabasco point is different from 3 chutney points, and that requires a bit of information. But it is a growing pain of having these systems in place. But the benefit of having those teams autonomous enough to generate new ideas is worth the trade-off. But there are things like that.
There's a reason we live with the fact that different countries have different currencies. So we sort of figure out how to deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. But there are pains. There are pains, and to say that it wasn't would be unfair. The other one, the story black hole. So because we have a system that everybody in the business can write a story, we did have a long time where people would just write stories and then punt them into the abyss. And that's why we introduced that system where 1, they get binned, and 2, they come through and get agreed by a developer working with a story owner, as opposed to somebody just writing a story on a bit of card and then not worrying about it again. So we had this. This is real, and then we bend it. Because a story that's 6 months old, even if it turns out is the most valuable story in the world, 6 months old means that you now need to reinvestigate it because you've forgotten it. And the processes that would have meant you would have implemented one way have now changed. And so there is no value in this archive. Quite happy to argue that to the customer.
Yeah, anyone who's tried to do something like getting things done has experienced the same thing. They look in their backlog of stuff, and there's stuff they put in there a year ago, and you think, oh, well, it might be nice to say in 3 years, oh yeah, I remembered I wanted to do that. Nah, if you want to do it, you'll write it again.
Absolutely, and another one of the pitfalls is that someone makes the mistake of actually believing that. So let's say one of our most experienced developers writes a story, puts it in the archive, and one of our most junior developers then comes a year later and then sees that story and goes, well, he knows what he's talking about, so I'm going to take it as writ that he's right. And that's actually really bad, because it's not that he was wrong, it's just that things have changed. So they're actually quite dangerous to have lying around. They're like little landmines of information that no longer apply to reality. Home-baked dev infrastructure, so being this flexible, things can creep, and we've had to combat that. We have this thing called Borat Days, where the team across the 3 different teams tries to unify its DevOps processes to try and make us more robust while still maintaining that flexibility. So these are the things that we're working on at the moment. But things that we're experimenting on is breaking the fellowship. So we've split one of the teams already, and we've split 2 of the teams already, but we're going to do it again. So as soon as we get enough people to incubate a new team, we're going to, and it's quite a painful process because people are like, oh, I used to like working with that guy, and they move out to separate teams, and also splitting code bases is a fair amount of work in itself. But again, it's proven to be useful because the flexibility that you get from having separate deployments going on in different parts of the business has been crucial.
Wait, did you say when you split teams, you split code bases? Did everybody else hear that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Of course. Quarterly team rotations. So if you're bored of writing front-end Agile work and you'd like to mess around with databases, the business allows for it. So developers can switch in. We don't allow it too often, that's why it's quarterly, because it's quite disruptive, because there's still a lot of information locked in the developer's head that is useful, but they can still move around. So over the course of a year, you could go through all 3 teams without disrupting the speed of that team significantly. So as I said, cross-team pairing to work on infrastructure to make sure that things are robust. And the reason it's cross-team is because those concerns are independent of the individual product strands. Tech Academy graduation, so these are 3 latest recruits. Aaron, he came in from solutions engineering and now is turning into a developer. So we try to train people internally as well because they make better developers in the long run for us. And also Dev Exchange, so this is something that we're trying out where we're talking to other businesses. So we've already done it with 7 Digital, Mendeley, and Redgate, where we swap a developer for a week, just so that they can experience an entirely different system and bring that in, as well as people like me going out and talking about it. So if you're interested, let me know, and we can see if we can organize a swap. Most businesses are actually pretty keen on the idea for the same reasons that we are. It shares info. And also have fun. If you don't have a team that enjoys working with each other, no amount of processes, no amount of Nerf guns will garner a good result. So make sure the team cares about each other because you get better results. Cool, thank you very much.
Thanks, Arber.
Feature requests, you said that you want everything to go into the bin. How transparent are you going back to your users with the business reasons for putting that in the bin?
As brutally as possible. It's the biggest time that this was difficult was when we went from having that massive archive of stories and moving things to the bin. Now we don't have to be as brutal because they understand that things without strong business value will get left and will only become revived if the new business need arises. But in that changeover period, we had to go, look, I know the story is really important to you, but we're putting it away and we're not going to talk about it until there's a stronger business value. And we were as straightforward as we could be about it, so that next time around they knew that unless there's a strong business value of it, you're not going to get very far. And that was a conversation we had with individual users and with stakeholders. So even heads of departments, we just look, this is not a big deal for the entire company, so we're putting it on us. So as straightforward and as transparent as we can be.
Okay, thanks, Arber. Are you around for a while anyway?
Yeah, I'm around for quite a while.
Okay, thanks very much.